She kept a pair of blue shoes in her shop window for nearly 15 years. People said they were cursed. Others said they were a promise. But the truth behind those shoes, and the woman who never sold them, was something no one in town ever really knew, until the day a stranger walked in. The first thing people noticed when they walked past the little shoe shop on Maple Avenue was the window display. It was simple. A few pairs of polished leather boots, some worn children's shoes, a stack of Polish tins. But in the very center, under a single yellow bulb that buzzed softly when the nights were cold, sat a pair of women's shoes that no one ever seemed to buy. They were pale blue, the kind of blue that reminded people of a sky right after a storm. The leather had never been scuffed. The laces were tied into a perfect bow. And every evening, Mrs. Rourke would dust them gently with a soft cloth, as if waiting for someone specific to walk in and claim them. Her husband, Frank, had opened the shop after the war, one of those small-town men who could fix anything that had a soul and a heartbeat. But it was his wife, Ellen, who kept the window. She had the patience for arranging things just right, the tenderness for knowing how shoes should feel on tired feet. People remember how something fits, she would say, especially when everything else in life doesn't. By 1949, the town had changed. The old factories were running again, the trains ran on time, and people were smiling a little more easily. But in the Rourke's shop, time moved slower. The air always smelled of leather and beeswax. A small radio played softly behind the counter, and Ellen would hum along to songs she only half remembered. Every now and then, a customer would ask about the blue shoes. "They're not for sale," she'd say, always with a polite smile. No one pressed further. In small towns, you learn to respect certain mysteries. Some thought maybe she was saving them for a daughter. Others whispered that they were meant for someone who never came home. Children liked to guess that the shoes were magic, that whoever wore them would dance forever. No one ever saw Ellen wear them herself, though sometimes, in the reflection of the shop glass, it looked as though she wanted to. She kept a small notebook beneath the counter where she wrote every customer's name, what kind of shoes they bought, and whether they mentioned needing repairs. But on the last page there was only one entry, written years earlier, in faded ink. Blue shoes promised, not delivered. Frank never asked her about it. He just worked quietly in the back, hammering nails into soles, replacing heels, patching leather. The rhythmic tapping filled the silence between them like a heartbeat they both depended on. When the evenings grew long and the shop emptied out, Ellen would sit by the window with a cup of tea, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one. Sometimes she'd look at those shoes, really look, and the years seemed to fold in on themselves. Once, someone had stood beside her, laughing, saying she'd look beautiful in blue. Once there had been a dress, a plan, a future. And then nothing. So she waited, not for a customer, but for a moment that never returned. And every morning she opened the shop again, dusted the shoes, and straightened the bow. The doorbell chimed, the radio hummed, and life, quiet, fragile life, went on. By the spring of 1951, the little shop on Maple Avenue had become something of a landmark. Children on their way to school would press their noses to the glass, staring at the blue shoes that had outlasted every season, every sale, every rumor. Some shopkeepers changed their displays for the holidays, red ribbons in December, daisies in April, but Ellen's window never changed. On a quiet Tuesday morning, the bell above the door jingled, and a woman stepped in. She was young, perhaps 30, with dark hair pinned neatly under a kerchief. She looked around the room like someone stepping into a memory she didn't realize she still carried. Ellen greeted her with her usual warmth. "Good morning, dear. Looking for something special?" The woman hesitated. "Just curious," she said softly. Her eyes flicked toward the window. Those blue shoes. How long have you had them? Ellen smiled the way she always did when that question came. Oh, they've been here a while. They're waiting for the right person. The stranger studied them closely. They looked just like the pair my sister wanted before she stopped herself. Before the war. Something in her tone made Ellen's hands still. She'd heard that same pause, that same unfinished sentence, more times than she could count. The war had taken too many sisters, too many unfinished stories. Would you like to try them on? Ellen offered. The woman shook her head. No, I couldn't. She smiled politely, thanked her, and left. But as she crossed the street, Ellen noticed. The woman looked back at the window twice, as if the shoes were tugging at something deep in her chest. That night, when the lamps were dimmed and Frank had gone upstairs, Ellen sat at the counter and opened her little notebook again. On the last page, below the old faded words, "Blue shoes. Promised. Not delivered." She wrote another line. Asked about by a stranger with the same eyes. She didn't know why she wrote it. Only that she felt the faint echo of something returning. Weeks passed. The woman never came back, but the feeling lingered. Ellen began to notice how certain customers looked at the shoes, not with curiosity, but recognition. Perhaps everyone saw their own loss reflected there. Perhaps the shoes had become something more than leather and thread. One rainy afternoon, a delivery boy arrived with a parcel addressed to Mrs. Ellen Rourke, the cobbler's shop, Maple Avenue. Inside was a small wooden box wrapped in brown paper. No return name. When she opened it, there was a folded photograph. Two young women laughing on a city street, one holding a pair of blue shoes identical to those in her window. Ellen pressed her hand to her mouth. The back of the photograph read, "For the girl who never wore them. For the one who still waits." She sat for a long time, the rain streaking the glass like tears on a memory. Frank came out from the workshop and found her still sitting there, the photo trembling in her hands. He didn't ask what it was. He just stood beside her and looked out the window, where the blue shoes glowed softly under the streetlight. That night, Ellen dreamed, not of loss, but of laughter. She woke with tears on her face, but for the first time in years, they weren't heavy. The next morning, she placed the photograph inside the display, tucked discreetly behind the shoes. Most people never noticed it, but a few did. They'd pause, lean closer, and smile as if they understood something unspoken. The shop began to change in small ways. Customers lingered longer, talking about memories they hadn't shared in years. The smell of home, a song from the radio, the sound of someone's laughter before everything changed. Ellen listened, nodded, and fixed their shoes with quiet care. And though she never told anyone, Ellen had decided something. The shoes would stay right there, forever untouched. Not as a sale item, not as decoration, but as a promise kept at last. By 1953, everyone in town knew about the blue shoes in Ellen Rourke's window. They'd become something more than merchandise, almost a landmark of quiet mystery. People would give directions using them, turn left at the shop with the blue shoes. Couples passed by and whispered stories about who they thought the shoes belonged to. Children dared each other to touch the window, saying if they did, they'd dream of the person who once wore them. Ellen never corrected any of it. She simply smiled when people mentioned the legend. In a way, the stories people told had given the shoes a new kind of life, one she could never have created herself. The years had softened her hair to silver, but her posture remained as straight as the day she first opened the shop door. Frank's hands had grown slower, the tapping of his hammer less steady, but the rhythm of their days didn't change. Open at 8, sweep the floor, polish the glass, dust the blue shoes. One afternoon, a young journalist came in, a woman from the Maple County Gazette with bright eyes and a notebook full of questions. She'd heard the rumors and wanted to write a piece about the unsold shoes. "Mrs. Rourke," she began gently, "people say those shoes have been in your window for over 10 years. Is there a story behind them?" Ellen looked up from her polishing cloth, considering her answer. "There's always a story," she said at last. "But sometimes the telling of it takes more than words." The journalist smiled. "And maybe we can tell it together." For the first time, Ellen agreed. She didn't give details. Not the names, not the loss. Just fragments. They were meant for someone I loved. The day she was to wear them, the world fell apart. I kept them here to remind myself that beauty still exists, even when life doesn't go as planned. The reporter was quiet for a long time. Then she wrote her article and titled it, "The Promise in the Window." It ran on the front page of the Sunday edition. By Monday, the shop was busier than it had been in years. People came not to buy, but to see. Some left flowers. Others left notes. One man placed a folded handkerchief under the shoes with the words, "For my wife, who never got to dance in her new shoes either." The little shop became a kind of sanctuary, a place for remembrance. Ellen didn't ask questions or turn anyone away. She simply made space for their silence. One winter evening after closing, Frank found her standing at the window again. The reflection of the blue shoes shimmered in the glass beside her face. "You know," he said softly, "you've turned that window into something holy." Ellen smiled faintly. "Maybe it's not the shoes," she said. "Maybe people just needed a place to put their love." She turned and looked at him, really looked, and saw the quiet strength in his tired eyes. He had waited too. Waited through grief, through the long years of silence she never explained, through the life they built together that was part love, part memory, part unspoken forgiveness. That night, after he'd gone to bed, Ellen opened her notebook one last time. On the last page, beneath "Blue Shoes Promised, Not Delivered," and "Asked about by a stranger with the same eyes," she wrote, "Perhaps the promise was never meant to be kept by one person alone." She set the notebook aside and gazed out into the sleeping town. A faint snow had begun to fall, coating the street in soft white light. Across the road, she saw a little girl tug at her mother's hand, pointing to the shoes as they passed. The mother smiled down at her and whispered something tender, something that made the girl's eyes widen in wonder. Ellen pressed her palm to the glass, her breath fogging the reflection. For the first time in many years, she whispered aloud to the empty shop, "Annie, they remember you." The next morning, the shoes seemed to glow brighter than usual in the pale light of dawn. Customers swore they looked newer somehow, untouched by time. Ellen never confirmed or denied it. She just unlocked the door, turned on the radio, and let the music drift through the shop like it always had. The article had done something she never expected. It turned her private grief into a shared memory, a thread connecting strangers through something as simple as a pair of shoes that never found their feet. And though she didn't say it out loud, she felt it deep inside her chest. Maybe that was the point all along. Some promises aren't broken. They're transformed. It was early autumn when he arrived. The man who would change everything. The leaves had only just begun to turn, drifting lazily across Maple Avenue, settling in small piles against the shop door. Ellen was sweeping as she always did, the smell of polish and coffee filling the quiet space. The bell jingled softly, and when she looked up, a man stood in the doorway, tall, a little stooped, with a cap in his hands and a weathered face that carried too many years of sun and silence. "Good morning," Ellen said, brushing the last of the leaves from the threshold. "You're early. We don't usually get customers before 9. He nodded politely. "I read about you in the Gazette," he said. "About the shoes. His voice had that hesitant tone people used when they came to speak of something they weren't sure they had the right to mention. Ellen smiled gently. Ah, yes. They've been famous lately, haven't they? You came to see them. He stepped closer to the window display. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, quietly, he whispered, I think I once knew the girl who was meant to wear them. The air seemed to still around them. Ellen's hands trembled slightly on the broom handle. You did? She asked softly. He nodded, eyes still fixed on the glass. Annie Moore, wasn't it? We were stationed in London before the end. She used to talk about her sister all the time. Said she'd saved every penny to buy her a pair of blue shoes for her wedding. Ellen couldn't breathe. For years, she had carried her sister's name like a fragile secret, never spoken aloud, never shared. Now, hearing it in the voice of a stranger, it felt like the world itself had turned full circle. The man took a breath. I wasn't there when she... He stopped, swallowed hard. But I kept something of hers. I didn't know where to send it. From his coat pocket, he pulled a small envelope, edges yellowed with age. Inside was a folded scrap of paper, brittle but legible. Ellen unfolded it with trembling fingers. It was her sister's handwriting. Just 2 lines. Tell Ellen I'm not afraid. Blue suits her better than me. Ellen pressed the paper to her heart. Tears welled in her eyes, not heavy, but light, the kind that carry more gratitude than grief. She looked up at the man, who stood there silently, hat in his hands, as though afraid to disturb the moment. Thank you, she whispered. You've brought her home. He nodded once, quietly. I thought you should know she wasn't alone. Then he tipped his hat, turned, and left the shop as quietly as he had entered. That night, Ellen didn't turn the sign to closed. She left the lights on, the shoes glowing softly in the window like 2 captured pieces of sky. The note, folded and framed, rested behind them, a silent promise finally kept. When Frank came downstairs, he found her sitting by the window with a cup of tea, staring at the shoes. You've been waiting for this, haven't you? He said gently. She smiled faintly. Not for the shoes. For peace. He took her hand, and together they watched the street grow dark. Across the road, the lamplight flickered, and the world outside their window seemed to exhale, as if even the town itself understood that something had finally come to rest. The next morning, Ellen changed the display for the first time in 15 years. The blue shoes stayed, but beside them she placed a small card that read, For Annie, and for everyone still waiting. People noticed, of course. Some stopped to read the new sign. Others just smiled quietly and went on their way. But the air around the little shop changed. Softer, lighter. It no longer felt like a place frozen in grief. It felt like a place that had remembered how to breathe. In the weeks that followed, letters began arriving, not orders but stories. Notes from strangers who'd read about the window and wanted to share their own losses, their own memories of someone they still carried. Ellen answered each one with a few careful lines in her neat handwriting. Love never leaves. It only waits until we're ready to see it again. By Christmas, the window was full of small mementos. Pressed flowers, old photographs, folded notes tied with ribbons. She kept them all. To anyone else, it might have looked cluttered, but to Ellen, it was beautiful. A mosaic of remembrance built by the hands of 100 strangers. Sometimes, late in the evening, she still caught herself humming as she cleaned the glass, her reflection merging with the glow of the shoes. But now, when she whispered her sister's name, it wasn't to fill the silence. It was to share it. Years later, after Ellen and Frank were both gone, the shop changed owners. The new cobbler found the shoes still in the window, a little faded now, but still intact. He kept them there, out of respect, never moving them, never selling them. And though few in town remembered who they had once belonged to, everyone still knew what they meant. Because on Maple Avenue, people said that as long as those shoes stayed in the window, no promise, however long delayed, was ever truly broken. Sometimes, the things we keep, a letter, a photograph, or even a pair of blue shoes, hold the stories we can't say out loud. They remind us that love doesn't vanish when time moves on. It just finds new places to live. If this story touched your heart, don't let it fade when the screen goes dark. Subscribe to our channel, where memories are never forgotten, and every story finds its way home again.